the advisory group on board.
All right, going live on YouTube.
Yep.
Ed, do you want to go ahead and welcome us?
Yes, I'd like to welcome everybody here today. It's still very interesting. It seems like whenever we have our community advisory group meetings, we're either going through snow or something big. There's always some big event. So all of you, I know you're keeping up with everything that's going on in the world today. And so we welcome. I hope you all made it through the cold spell in one piece. And I would like to ask Johnell to please review the closed captioning and zooming participants, and 2 for viewers. Man, what am I? Johnell, take it over.
Right. If we could good afternoon, everyone. If we could get the slides up here. Just a reminder, closed captions are available in English and Spanish. English closed captions are available within Zoom and YouTube. Users can follow this link to view both English and Spanish captions in a separate browser window. https://ibr.news/captions. Next slide, please. Reminder how to access closed captions. At the bottom middle of your screen, you should see a menu of options. If you can't see the menu, hover your mouse over the bottom middle of the screen. Then click on the CC icon and a separate window with captions will appear. Next slide, please. Just a reminder of our ASL interpretation. In the effort to continue to center equity, there is an ASL interpreter in addition to closed captioning. To make sure the interpreter is always visible, please right-click your video and select Spotlight Video. For those watching on YouTube, when we screen share, you will be able to see the slideshow, closed captioning, and the ASL interpreter. You will still be able to hear different people speaking, but may not see them. Next slide, please. Just again, tips for the webinar. Again, thank you for joining us today. Please join audio by either phone or computer, but not by both. We encourage panelists to turn on your video. Please keep your audio on mute when not speaking. If you experience technical difficulties, please contact program staff at 360-329-6744. Next slide, please. Again, public input instructions. There will be an opportunity to provide brief public input later in today's meeting, around about 5:45. To dial in by phone, use the following instructions. You'll want to dial 1-669-900-6833. You'll want to include the meeting ID number, which is 993-5459-6043, and utilize a passcode, which is 674942. You'll want to dial *9 to raise your hand. After you are invited to speak, please dial *6 to unmute yourself. Next slide, please. To submit comment after the meeting, please fill out the comment form on the program website or email your comments to info@interstatebridge.org with CAG Public Comment in the subject line. You may also call 360-859-0494 for Washington residents, or 503-897-89218 for Oregon residents, or you may also call the 800 number at 1-888-503-6735. And state CAG Public Comment in your message. Written comments need to explicitly say CAG Public Comment in the subject line or in the body of the message for them to be identified and distributed to CAG members. All written comments must be received prior to 48 hours in advance of each upcoming meeting in order to be distributed to advisory group members. Comments received after that point will be distributed to members in advance of their next meeting. Next slide. And I believe I'm turning it over to Lisa.
Thanks, Johnell. I wanted to just kind of share again and reiterate our member commitments. We try to center the room and the space around these commitments that we established together in early 2020. Those include putting relationships first, keeping focused on our common goal, noticing the power dynamics in the room, creating a space for multiple truths and norms, being kind and brave, practicing examining racially biased systems and processes, and looking for learning. Our meeting agenda today includes a welcome by our program administrator. We had our co-chair, Ed Washington, kind of start the meeting and kick us off today. We'll follow after the program updates with an IBR CAG work plan update by our Deputy Project Manager, John Willis. We'll transition into the transit technical analysis overview, our fall transit community engagement feedback and report, our transit equity analysis overview, and then we will continue to move forward with public comment. We wanted to just mention in this space that we recognize that there was a lot of data that was sent to you, a lot of information. This meeting's going to feel a little bit like we're spending quite a bit of time talking to you as opposed to being engaged in a conversation with you. We feel like sharing this information and these three major components are so essential in the current pace and where we are within the program that we really just want to kind of set you up for success in this space in terms of we'll allow for three different distinct opportunities where Lynn will then be able to facilitate a conversation and answer any questions, but we suspect we may not be able to, in this space today, answer all of your questions. And so we'll take good notes and set up some more time for us to do that in the future. So just wanted to kind of just do a little bit of ground setting today that there is quite a bit of information that the team will be sharing. And I think with that, I will pass it on over to our program administrator, Greg, for your update.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, everybody. Once again, Greg Johnson, IBR Program Administrator. So I'm going to try and keep my remarks short and to the point so we can get the technical presentations in. So it may leave more time for questions, but we are in the process, as they say. We are getting things done. The program has been running through models and through data, and we're preparing within the next month and a half to start bringing to groups like the Community Advisory Group what our recommendations are for some key questions. And those key questions will be what mode of high capacity transit, what the interchange on Hayden Island will look like, how many auxiliary lanes will exist in this corridor. So all of those issues are being looked into by our team, a tremendous amount of work going forward. We're also looking at the bridge configuration, whether it will be a stack configuration or side by side. So a lot of good information being put forward. So we are also having conversations with our federal partners. We know that we are going to be in a supplemental environmental impact statement process once we receive direction from our executive steering group and from the bi-state legislative committee. Once we get their endorsement, we know that that next step in the environmental process will be a supplemental environmental process that will now take us into 2023 to start figuring out what we are going to move forward, what we are going to build. That will be a very public process, and the Community Advisory Group will be engaged throughout that entire process, understanding what is being put forward. Other things that are going on, we're having conversations with our federal partners in both in locally here in Washington and Oregon, but also in Washington, D.C. to understand what the funding opportunities for federal funds are going to look like. So that conversation will be in full bloom next week with a visit of some key folks to Washington, D.C. to once again engage both USDOT as well as congressional offices on where the program is at and how it plans to move forward. Other things, we've been having great conversation with our tribal partners. So we are understanding the concerns of a number of tribes in the region. So those are conversations that are going forward and will continue to move forward. So a lot of good things happening, but once again, I don't want to dominate the space, but I'll take any questions that members of the CAG may have.
I see Andrew has his hand raised.
Thank you, Johnell, and hello, everybody on the advisory group. And Greg, thank you for the update. I wanted to raise a serious concern that I think I'm sure has been discussed at the bi-state committee and also just broadly covered in the media as well. And this is the way that Washington is presently advancing payment of this bridge through the legislature, or in part of, using an export tax specifically targeting Oregon and Washington. And I raise this because, first, I mean, on its surface, as was covered, the idea of paying for the bridge by taxing Oregonians through an export tax is, of course, questionably dubious on a legal front, but it just sets a precedence of interstate, a lack of interstate collaboration to be able to pay for these big issues. So I want to say two things. First is a comment to all my colleague committee members here. While getting into the weeds of taxation and how we pay for things may not be your maybe first inclination or instinct, it is extremely important about how we revenue this bridge. And it would have serious consequences for Oregonians who have to pay increased costs for this. And so I'm highly concerned about this. And I ask my colleagues on the Washington side of the border and everybody here that this is the time to act in the state legislature with Washington, of which I do not understand personally, but I don't quite understand all things. So I would just say, number one, I would ask that there be engagement there, and then get, Greg, just maybe your thoughts and evaluation of how that conversation has been had at the bi-state committee, and the idea of revenue, how we will find the revenue to support this, just in light of these recent activities. I hope that is an easy answer.
It is not. It's a complex answer. So we have not had a bi-state legislative meeting since the Move Washington legislation has been put on the table. Our program has no position on how the legislature in either state chooses to move forward. That's not our role. Our role is to put on the table the needs for this program. So we cannot comment on how either state chooses to move forward with their local share. But we understand the controversy surrounding it. But once again, we do not have a comment on how they move forward. So,
Okay, we have,
other questions or
Yep.
concerns?
yeah, we have Jana, and then we'll go to Sherry and then Martha.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing this issue up, Andrew. I think more than just a question of the kind of talk that Washington legislators have had over the past several days about how this export tax will allow us to pay both sides of the bridge, is the larger issue of this particular proposal violating the U.S. Commerce Clause and being tied up in years of litigation, which would negatively impact the ability for this project to move forward. I think that's the larger issue. And it needs to be recognized by this group here today. And it needs to be said that there are a number of legislators who are wondering, are reconsidering their involvement with this particular project. And so I think it puts at risk all of the work that we have done to date, and that ought to be recognized by everyone sitting on this committee. So thank you.
Sherry and then Martha.
Thank you, Johnell. I would also like to thank Andrew for bringing this topic up. I sit here on the Washington side, and I can tell you that as you know, an industry lobbyist and representative of a trade group, there was no collaboration. I mean, we, along with many others, found out about this concept during a Tuesday press conference. So I've been reached out by several parties to find out how the Trucking Association is aligned on this mode of funding. We've weighed in with both House and Senate Transportation Committees. We're not really actually even sure who conceived of the idea, where it came from, but we're very much opposed to it. And our opposition isn't so much, I mean, it is about infrastructure for us. I mean, we're an industry that is dependent on roads. And that's our big concern. It's not just the vicarious nature of it. It promises to cost Washington taxpayers millions in litigation, and as Jana mentioned, delays the bridge project. And in my mind, what I'm not hearing so much is the goodwill that I think this group and others, I'm sure, has created between Washington and Oregon to be able to move positively forward on this bridge project. So we've been, we're opposed to it. I want to make that clear. But we're not getting much airtime in terms of, you know, it's all been expressed, and we're going to be doing a little more outreach at the request of various people, because it is an important thing to us, and people expect to hear from us. So I appreciate you bringing it up, and it's good to know where everyone stands.
And I do want to jump back into the conversation to say that the IBR team has no voice in this conversation. We are, once again, we are neutral. We don't tell either the Washington legislature or the Oregon legislature how to go about their business. The one thing, I know that this is tremendously controversial, but there are other revenue sources that are a part of this. So we're watching it very carefully, but once again, we remain neutral on how this moves forward.
Well, Martha, Tom, Bill, and Mark.
Yeah, I'm not connected to the legislature. I'm just a Washington resident. And to my mind, when I saw this in the paper the first time, I thought, well, this is payback for Oregon trying to impose tolls on Washington state residents who have to drive the bridges in both directions every day for work. And I understand that there's a lot of other stuff going on besides that, but just from an individual residential perspective, that's what I think. And that may not have anything to do with anything, but that's all. I don't require a response.
Tom, Bill, and then Mark.
Yes, I think we need to respect Greg's position here, because not everybody has the same thoughts here. And I understand the Portland Business Alliance and the trucking and all, but I truly think that you need to do that through your associations and not the CAG, because we won't be speaking with one voice on that. So I think we need to respect Greg's position on this.
We'll have Bill and then Jasmine, and then we're going to move on to the rest of our agenda here.
And I respectfully disagree with what Tom said, because we are part of the community. And as I recall, part of the joint committee on the I-5 bridge are legislators that are from both states that have voices on in the actual activity of the bridge. Therefore, they need to know what some members of the CAG have the feelings. So Greg, I think you could at least report to them that these are the feelings. You don't have to take a position in the overall legislation, but I think that kind of a message needs to go back to those legislators that are involved in this effort. I looked in the book here and saw about, I don't know, what is it, 8 or 10 on each state that have a position on a committee. So that's all I want to say. Is just I think you do have a responsibility to say that this kind of an issue has been brought up and discussed, and just wanted you to know about that from the legislative standpoint.
Right, we'll have Jasmine and then wrap up with Jana, and then we'll move on.
You know, I understand, and we will report back that we have heard different voices on this issue, but it is not the IBR team's role to take a position on it. We'll report back that we have heard from individual members of the CAG, but the CAG is not speaking to this issue. It's not the CAG's issue to speak to. Individuals on the CAG can speak to it. But once again, the purpose of the community advisory group is to advise on the bridge itself.
Thank you, Greg. And that's what I wanted to echo as well, because I actually agree with Tom Gentry in that we all have different stakeholders in this bridge topic. And so speaking as the CAG just doesn't quite make sense and doesn't really align with the reasons for why we're here as well. But I'm open to separate conversations, but absolutely, I think that these are two different discussions, and this may not be the correct avenue to advocate.
And then Jana?
Yes, I want to clarify. I certainly wasn't looking for anyone's support or opposition to our position, and I don't think Andrew was either. I think it's important for you all to be aware that this issue is out there and it has a huge impact on the future of this bridge. And it might be easy to think that we can just move forward and ignore it and not respond to it or take a position on it or whatever. But the fact of the matter remains that if in fact this gets all tied up in litigation, the funding for the bridge will not be there to do the project. And I think that is something that needs to be part of the conversation. And that's why it came up. And I do appreciate you bringing it up, Andrew. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for that. Okay, let's keep progressing with our agenda here. Next up. John?
Yeah, hi, I'm John Willis. I'm the Deputy Program Manager for the program. Thanks for having me tonight to talk a little bit about the work plan. Greg did a great job of laying out where we're going. And on the next slide here, you're going to see it in a bit of a schedule. There's a lot of products the team is preparing right now. One of the important ones, one of the vehicles, as our team likes to say, is the modified LPA. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes so we can get into the really good meat here. This contains, the modified LPA contains a framework of elements that are going to define what we're moving forward. We've talked about this before, but here we are taking all of that information that's coming out of our team and pulling it together into something unified. And so where does the CAG fit in all of this? We are asking this group for input on individual design components. You can see transit, Hayden Island and Marine Drive, the river crossing downtown. We are going to get input on those, as well as some overarching features as we look at auxiliary lanes and the like. When we get to April, our team will be stitching all of this together into the modified LPA, and we're going to be asking you, the CAG, to be making a recommendation on that holistic stitched together modified LPA. So what I just want to say a few things as we get to that point, and then into May and June as we go through the sausage making to get it approved through various groups. Our commitment to you as a team, there's really three things I want to share that our team needs to do. Our program team needs to do our part to present what is essentially a lot of really dense information, as Lisa alluded to earlier, into something that's very accessible to this group. We know you're volunteers. We know your time is limited. We want to distill that information to a level that works for you. We also want to do our part to link all of our evaluations to the community values and priority work that you did back a little while back. And then finally, we want to create multiple touches, at least 2 times as we're going through this, so that you have a chance to absorb the information, and then we can have a conversation. You'll see that there is in response to all that, we have a lot more CAG meetings that are part of the program moving forward, and hopefully enough time to vet issues, discuss them, and create the right kind of information and ultimately recommendation. So I'll leave it at that and see if there's any questions so that we can get to the real good stuff. Okay. Thanks. I'll turn it over to our facilitators.
Okay, next slide, please. You'll recall from our last meeting, you had an opportunity of weighing in and helping to determine of all of the design options, which did you want to spend more time on? And so here's just a reminder of how you all ranked levels of importance by CAG, first being transit mode, second being number of auxiliary lanes, third bridge crossing and alignment, 4 was interchanges, Hayden Island and Marine Drive, and 5 interchanges, Vancouver. So as a reminder, we have a lot of material that will be coming to the CAG over the next several months as we lead into working to develop the modified LPA. Next slide, please. You'll recall that at our January 6th meeting, we really looked at the values poll results. And as indicated, the top 6 vote in terms of our values. Again, you passed a values document last year. Number 1 was all modes of transportation to increase capacity of river crossing is essential to effectively and safely move more people, goods, and service, 88%. Congestion was 83%. Informed data-driven decision-making, 71%. Bi-state cooperation, 67%. Economic empowerment, 54%. And transportation facilities must reflect the needs of all ages and abilities and remove barriers, including language, to access and ensure availability to transportation choices. And so the values that CAG adopted will be a lens by which we start to bring material to you relative to the design options. Of all the values, here are the ones that you listed as being most critically important as a lens for our work together. Next slide. Just a reminder, we will be having additional CAG meetings, including 2 per month as we move forward with a modified LPA. And here's just a list of those meetings. You'll also receive this in email as well as calendar invites. So thank you in advance for your additional time as volunteers as we work closely together to advance this work. Next slide. So in our first topical area, we have an opportunity today to hear an in-depth presentation from Kelly Betteridge, who is part of our IBR transit team, transit design team. And Kelly's prepared to provide additional material relative to a summary of draft findings, as well as next steps relative to our IBR transit investment. So with that, Kelly, I turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much.
I would like to stop just for a second here. Tom Hickey brought up last time about the concern of the poll when you put Hayden Drive and Marine Drive, and you said that you were going to look at this. Because that's a small area, you didn't get a lot of votes. Yet now I see that we have it set in concrete, and it's on that first slide of yours saying that this is the priority. And I think that that needs to be eliminated from it or relooked.
I'm going to ask Lisa and Jason to chime in a little here.
Can we go back to that slide real quick so that we can just make sure that we're all on the same, looking at the same information. So Tom, I just want to reflect what I'm hearing you, that is your suggestion that the interchange Hayden Island Marine Drive being lower or being combined as one option may not reflect the importance of what that option is, or the ability for enough folks to weigh in to increase the importance of that option?
I would like to refer that to Tom Hickey. He made the presentation last time on it and really touched on it well.
Well, so my concern was at the time that because we were voting on sort of local issues, that we were getting kind of a diluted sense of importance for those issues within those local areas. As far as I can tell from what I'm seeing on the slide, the fact that Hayden Island and Marine Drive are getting, you know, some attention here, and certainly the next meeting in 2 weeks will be about the Marine Drive and Hayden Island interchanges. I feel like those things are getting the focus that they need, at least as best as this committee can drill down on them. So I don't see it as an issue of, I don't see it as a problem right now, so long as they don't get like pushed off the table by virtue of the fact that they were regional concerns rather than project-wide concerns. So long as we talk about them, that's my main concern.
I support Tom in this.
Excellent. I think the intent of showing the values was also helping us with our technical team to prioritize what information moves before the community advisory group. So there's kind of two areas we're looking at. One, what technical information is ready, and two, what information our community advisory group is really hoping to spend a good deal of time focused on. So yes, our next time together, we really hope that we'll be able to spend the time on Marine Drive, Hayden Island. So glad that you were able to feel like we heard you and are able to reflect that in our CAG plan. Kelly, you're going to dive on into our transit investment information.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lisa. Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Betteridge. I'm a member of the IBR Transit team, and I'm excited to share some information with you tonight about the work that we have done to date in regard to the transit investment. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about the representative transit investments and remind you of some of the work that we've done to collect information about those investments. Also adding a little additional information for context about what's happened within Clark County since 2013, when the previous program, the Columbia River Crossing, ended. A lot of important work has been done by C-Tran and the City of Vancouver. I'll also talk at a high level about sort of draft findings for those transit investments regarding the transit measures that we've been studying for the last 6 months, and we'll talk about next steps. Next slide, please. All right, so first we'll talk about the transit investments. Next slide, please. So as you may recall, we did some work sort of late summer to identify a number of different representative transit investments. And the whole reason for doing this is to sort of define a set of potential investments and then sort of define them by mode and alignment and terminus, give them general station locations, general park and ride size and location, so that we could sort of code them into the regional model and start to understand how each of them operates in regard to each other. So of these investments, sort of what are the pros and cons, and how do each of them sort of provide different benefits? And so after a preferred transit solution is selected, so once we get to that locally preferred alternative step that was touched on earlier, then we'll take that particular option and really dive in and refine it and really sort of dial in the station locations and have a more robust conversation about things like park and ride. But again, this is just meant to be a way to frame a conversation about potential transit investments. Next slide. So here are those options that we've brought to you once before. So there's a total of 11 build options and then 1 no build. And the purpose of the no build is sort of if we moved forward in time to 2045 and a project was not built, we sort of use that as one scenario to weigh the other options that are built against, so that we kind of always understand what that investment does for the region. So of those 11 build options, we have 1 that was just bus on shoulder. We had 3 where the primary investment was BRT. 6 where the primary investment was LRT, and then 1 where we had an investment in both LRT and VRT. And that was sort of an extension from Expo Center, which is where the current yellow line terminates, to Hayden Island for light rail, and then also an extension of a dedicated facility for BRT from Vancouver to Hayden Island. So we'll head to the next slide, please. Since the last time that we chatted, we've actually added 2 more light rail options. And the reason for doing this is that as we sort of dove more deeply into these conversations about representative investments, it became clear that there was a real interest in studying what a station near the waterfront would mean in regard to ridership and connection. And so what you see on the map here are those 2 new options. One is option L, and it is an extension of light rail from the current terminus near Expo Center. It has a station at Hayden Island. It has a station near the waterfront, near Columbia, there in Vancouver, another station near Evergreen, and it terminates near McLaughlin and I-5. And then option M is essentially the same alignment, but instead of extending to McLaughlin and I-5, it terminates near Evergreen. So these are 2 new options that you haven't seen before, but they're really sort of a refinement of the options that we began the study with. Next slide, please. So as we were looking at all of these measures, at all of these potential investments, as a program team with all of our partners, we identified 16 different measures. So if you're thinking about an investment, what's the kind of information that you would want to know about how each of those perform? And so you can imagine a lot of those measures are about ridership. Who would ride it? How would they access it? When we think about transit, there's sort of 3 main ways to access transit. You could walk on, you could transfer from existing transit, bus or rail, or you could access it via personal vehicle with a park and ride. In addition, we had 1 specific measure that was about access for equity priority communities, which we'll talk about in more detail in the next presentation. And there's also just understanding the relative costs of these options, right? So when we think about costs for transit, we're both thinking about capital costs, so what it costs to build the infrastructure, but also the sort of daily operations and maintenance cost of each of these investments. And then we also want to know at a really high level, because we're talking about concepts at this time, what are the potential impacts of each of these investments? Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. Great, next slide again, sorry. So in addition to each of those pieces, so we've defined the potential investments, we've thought about the measures that we would use to understand how they perform. And then we also really needed to dive into understanding what's happened in Clark County since the previous program ended in 2013. So one really important thing that's happened is that CTRAN has developed and begun to implement their Vine BRT network, right? So I'm sure many of you have had a chance to ride that excellent service. They have 1 BRT line that's in operation. They have a second one that's in construction, and they have 1 that is in planning. Both the Vine and CTRAN Express bus service currently provide frequent and reliable service, both within Clark County and to downtown Portland, respectively. And as we think about this potential transit investment, we really want to make sure that it should be made with a desire to complement that Vine service that's really doing a great job of moving folks within the Clark County, and also thinking about it in terms of the existing service as well as that planned future service. In addition, the City of Vancouver has worked with CTRAN to design robust station environments for the Vine system on Broadway and Washington within the Central Business District of Vancouver. And with those investments in mind, we really think it's desirable to adjust the potential investment alignment to ensure that all of the modes, meaning this new investment, as well as the existing Vine, as well as Express Bus, function efficiently within the full transit network and respective operating environments. Next slide, please. The City of Vancouver has also seen substantial growth in the waterfront district as planned for in the waterfront development plan. And there's a real desire to serve that development more directly with a transit investment. And that's part of what we talked about with those 2 new options, L and M, that have that station. In addition, the population of the region is growing and diversifying. So since 2010, Clark County's population has grown by nearly 78,000, and about 76% of whom are people of color. So important things to keep in mind as we design this investment for the future. Next slide, please. So with all of those pieces in mind, and as we sort of have done the work to put the potential investments into the regional model, we start to see some sort of early findings about how each of these investments perform. So first of all of the build options substantially improve service over the no build, which is great. It means that any of these options would be a really great investment in terms of providing that cross-river transit travel. There's a lot of demand for cross-river transit service. So when we looked at this potential investment previously, the forecast year, or what we were looking at, was 2030. And now we're looking at a forecast year of 2045. And there's even more folks that are really interested and wanting to make that trip across the river. One of the really important pieces is to think about capacity, both in terms of the transit investment, so how many people can fit onto a given transit investment and make that trip across the river, as well as the built environment. So we really want to be mindful of, for light rail, the light rail options, downtown Vancouver, how does that work? Interstate Avenue, which is where the yellow line currently traverses. The Rose Quarter, which is where we see, buses and rail and cars and people and bikes all come together. The Steel Bridge, which is a really important connection for all of the modes as well, and also the Portland Transit Mall. For BRT, really want to be mindful of how downtown Vancouver works with those additional buses. And then also for the express bus, understanding both the downtown Vancouver piece and the Portland Transit Mall piece, because those express buses take folks from downtown Vancouver to downtown Portland. A transit investment that serves the identified markets and attempts to serve all of that demand will really need to include a combination of the Vine BRT, we think light rail, as well as express bus. There's just a lot of demand, and each of those pieces sort of provides an important tool in regard to getting those trips met. In addition, transfers from other transit vehicles are the highest mode of access for all of the representative transit investments. So this really tells us how important it is for this investment to conveniently connect to both the CTRAN and the TriNet systems, both existing and their planned systems. And when comparing the same representative alignment, so meaning same alignment, sort of same station locations, light rail options tend to have higher ridership than BRT options. Next slide, please. In addition, park and ride demand is robust in all of the representative investment scenarios, with the highest demand is attributed to those park and rides that have the most convenient access to Interstate 5. And options that include more stations serve more residents within walking distance, including BIPOC and low-income populations. All of the transit investments improve access to jobs, including BIPOC and low-income populations. And light rail investments improve access to jobs to a greater degree than BRT investments alone. And when comparing the same representative alignment, again, light rail options do have a higher capital cost and have a lower operating cost per rider than BRT options. So again, those are our high-level summary findings. The next step in the process is what we call winnowing, which is sort of, we have all these options and we need to move towards a smaller list so that we can dive in a bit more deeply. Next slide. So going forward, we need to get to a focused list, right? Because it's a lot to sort of think about 11 options and a bunch of different measures and really just think about the investment itself and what makes the most sense for the region. So the representative transit investment development process has taken place over the fall and the winter, so sort of about a 6-month process. And our goal has been to better understand the type of transit investment that would best serve the region and the corridor. And we cast a very wide net, right? So we looked at 16 measures. We really dug in to do a deeper understanding of what's happened since 2013 when the previous program ended. And we also did sort of high-level conceptual design work so that we could understand how those investments might work within the built environment. Next slide. And now the program is tasked with selecting a preferred transit investment. So we're really looking to refine both the mode and the alignment this spring. So as we move closer to that goal, we really want to narrow our focus, as I mentioned, to just a few representative investments that we can believe can sort of best balance what we're looking for in regard to providing that service and fitting within the built environment. And so that's sort of what we're hoping to get some of your feedback on as we move into and then through that winnowing process. Last slide. So again, sort of in terms of next steps, we're working to define that preferred transit investment, that means mode and alignment, that we would include in the locally preferred alternative. And then we would further study that option and really get into more of those details as we move into the environmental process. So hoping to get some of your feedback on the takeaways that I provided you and how those might inform sort of general thoughts and feedback about the mode, BRT or LRT, the general alignment and other things as well. And the intention is that we would return to this group in March to provide for you what we believe is that smaller list of transit investments. That's all for me.
Well, not exactly, because I imagine we'll have more than one or two questions, but we'll see. I do just want to remind all of us on CAG that there is a limited time. We don't want to spend so much time on the front end that we don't get to the things scheduled later. So I will be facilitating, but within that, you know, each of us should be mindful of the principles that we agreed to and we were reminded of in the beginning. But with that, Michael, looks like you have a question or comment.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Lynn, I'm sensitive to the point you just made up. As you can imagine, though, transit, of all the things we discuss here related to our options, is pretty important. I'm a resident of Clark County and I represent neighborhoods, particularly the Neighborhood Traffic Safety Alliance and things like that. I am interested. I'm also a transit rider during non-COVID times. And so, you know, I have that perspective as well. So I'll be brief because I just have some questions for Kelly and her team. So that I am understanding what you're using and looking through your slides. One thing I didn't see represented, maybe it's there and I missed it, is if your initial research, the draft that you shared, included study of trip times. I'm specifically interested in trip times from Clark County. So when you're measuring what's better than another alternative, is trip times part of that analysis? Because I can tell you from the perspective of a rider, not just me, but those I ride with, how quickly I can get somewhere is one of the most important considerations someone makes. And when you look at what's being used, you spoke about light rail use being higher. My follow-up question to that, this is my second question, is that higher overall or higher for Clark County riders who are trying to make their way over? You know, if that's not clear, because we're talking about significant light rail investments possibly on the Washington side of the river. And so there does need to be some focus on what, you know, factors go into what's working for them in trip times. And then the last question for you is, was safety a consideration on any of these modes?
Yes, great questions. Thank you, Michael. And I think some of them I can answer sort of quickly, and then others, maybe I'll sort of think about additional information I can bring when we come back in March. So in regard to travel time, that is one of the inputs that we have, and I can share that with you. So each of the options that we looked at, so those 11 build options, each have an assumed travel time. And so since they all tie into the expo center, that's one end of the travel time. So it's always sort of from the terminus to the expo center. And so I can provide that for you. But I agree entirely. And we know that as transit riders and transit users, that travel time is absolutely one of the most important factors. Your second question was about light rail ridership, I believe. And the answer is that when we compare sort of the same option, so same distance, same stations, same park and rides, there tends to be higher ridership if you compare the exact same thing for BRT versus LRT. I mean, there's a couple of reasons for that. And part of that is what I just mentioned, that all of the options are assumed to tie in at Expo Center. So if you were on BRT, you would have an additional transfer to make, because you would be, if you were headed further south than Expo, you would be transferring to the Max Yellow line in order to make the rest of your trip. And so, as you mentioned, travel time does matter in terms of how people make their decisions about the mode that they use. And so in those BRT options, there is an additional transfer. And your third question was about safety. And safety is always top of mind and something that is factored into all of our conversations, and especially as we think about the actual design and development of the process of the project, I'm sorry. And so that is something that we will continue to provide updates on, and is always top of mind as we think about various options, especially around design. I would like to know if I answered your question. Sorry, go ahead, Lynn.
You did. I appreciate it. Just quickly, is the express service that comes from C-Tran across to downtown, is that considered BRT or it's not?
So that particular option is with a build project. It would operate as bus on shoulder for the extent of the bridge, and then the rest of the service would operate in mixed traffic as it made its way to downtown. Thanks, Michael.
I also just want to offer to all of our CAG members, we got a huge slide deck. And so I think most of us probably took a quick look, but I will say a lot of the data is interrelated. So some of the things that we're talking about now will be covered also in a different way, but in the community engagement as well as in Jake's equity presentation. So just kind of be mindful. If you think, wait a minute, I thought I saw a slide about that. It might have been that you saw it a little bit later in the presentation, but thank you. Tom Gentry.
Lynn, I understand about the time here, but I think this one is important. In the slide, you said that I believe 78% of the growth in Vancouver was from people of color. Yet I look at the 2020 census to the 2010 census, and it shows that Vancouver's still 80% white, 3% Black, and that's not a change. So how did 78% of the growth come from that?
Good question. So this is one of the pieces that Jake, who gives, I think, our next presentation, will dive into in a little bit more detail. So I think he will be able to answer that a bit.
We can let Jake chime in now. He's on screen. Go ahead, Jake.
Yeah. I'm not sure exactly what you're looking at, Tom, but it's the growth, and this is consistent.
Slide 27.
Across, oh no, slide wise, I'm not sure what data he's looking at aside from that, but across the country as well as here regionally, the growth has largely been in communities of color. And off the top of my head, 20% is low for City of Vancouver as far as communities of color and what that comprises. I think it's closer to 30 now, and that has changed pretty significantly since 2010. So we can, if you've got some numbers that you're seeing discrepancies, happy to have a conversation with you offline. But yeah, that's what we found from the census.
And I also just want to interject here. I wasn't meaning that we shouldn't talk. This is a time for questions. It's just that we may not get to all of the questions. So I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have questions. So I apologize if that was the intent that I communicated. And Tom, it might be helpful for you to maybe do a screenshot or a link or something and send it, because I do think when we have different ideas about data, it's helpful to reconcile those. Otherwise, it's really hard to get to any kind of a shared understanding. So thank you for raising that question. Are there other questions? We do have some time. Transit was like a huge issue, and this is the first chance we've had to look at it. We'll be circling back, but there may well be other questions.
You know, Lynn, I just wanted to just see if, Michael, it sounded like you might have had several questions. And so the other thought that I had in this moment, given the amount of slides that we have, is if we could even touch base even after the meeting and make sure we're writing down all of those questions. We want to make sure that, one, we're answering the questions, and two, that if we need to create space to have a more in-depth conversation, because the three presentations don't answer the questions, that we do find time for that. So I just wanted to also, kind of build on what Lynn's saying. We do want questions. We know this presentation is really the first you're seeing of some of this significant data. And so this is not the only time that we'll address those questions. If you have them, send them over to Jason so that we can start making sure that we're working through them too.
I think one thing that might be particularly helpful, or is there other data that people might want to be informed, or do you want to maybe wait till the end of the presentation and kind of loop back at that point? All right, well, I don't see any other questions. So at this point, I'd like to put the slides back up and introduce Nicole Sherbert, who's our community engagement lead for the project. And this is all of the information that all of us, you helped drum up interest in and participation in. So it's exciting to get to see this. So Nicole, thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. So I think we're doing really good on time, so I'm excited because I have a lot of information to try and get through here in about 10 minutes. So I apologize if it seems like I'm going quickly. I just want to make sure that we touch on all of these slides. So as you are all probably aware, we did an extensive round of community engagement in the spring of 2021, and then we did another round in the fall. So the results I'm going to be talking about today are the results from that fall engagement period, which ran from October 2021 through early January 2022. We did actually extend it past, we had planned on going through December, and we extended it a little bit into January 22 to make sure that we were getting a representative sample of all of the communities we were looking at getting from the demographic standpoint. Both the spring and the fall community engagement reports are available on the program website. So while I'm going to touch on a few very high level kind of highlights, you can really dig further into the data in that full report. And then of course, if anybody does want the really extensive crosstab data, we can provide that as well. So if I can get the next slide. So we collected community feedback about all of the design options under consideration. So we were looking at specifically high capacity transit options, river crossing configurations, Vancouver interchanges, and Hayden Island Marine Drive interchanges. And we really used a variety of different tactics to collect both qualitative and quantitative feedback. And I apologize, the cat's been asleep the entire time. And then once I start talking, he wants to join in. So to get both qualitative and quantitative feedback. And we looked at a variety of different tactics to try to gather that feedback. So as you can see, we did an online survey, which most of you participated in. It was translated into 10 different languages, and you can see that we had over 9,600 responding participants. We also held 4 community working groups, and we had more than 300 participants in listening sessions. And these sessions were held in partnership with our community business organization mini grant participants, where we were able to offer various affinity sessions to several different equity priority groups to really maximize our engagement among those really important communities as we continue to focus equity throughout the entire program. We did, and you can see some of that a little bit at the bottom, we did extensive outreach and advertising to encourage participation through all of these tactics. You can have all of these things out there that you want to, but if you really don't encourage the participation in them, you're not going to get the feedback that you're looking for. So we had digital and print media advertising, as well as point of contact advertising with our transit partners. And those are bench ads, that sort of thing where you're really getting point of contact with the users of the actual options. So we also did community canvassing. We dropped off flyers with businesses and with our CBOs, providing information on how people could take the survey, how they could engage with the program, how they could find more information through our website, and how they could participate in the working groups and the listening sessions. And it is interesting, it's not on this slide, but we included a question at the beginning of this survey asking participants to share how they heard about the survey or about the other engagement opportunities. And about 72% of them had heard about it through social media. So it really does show that we have not only a very strong social media presence as the program itself, but also really extensive social media relationships with our CBO partners and with our program partners. So we have a really good engagement there, which is great to see. Next slide, please. As for the survey, as you all know, we offered a specific link to our advisory group members for participation in the survey. And by advisory groups, that includes this group, but also our equity advisory group. 44 of you completed the survey, so thank you for everyone who did take the time to complete that survey and for using our specific link so that we were able to track where our users are coming from in the surveys. In general, advisory group results were fairly consistent with the overall results, with just a few areas of differentiation, if you will. So I'll just go through those kind of quickly. Regarding the river crossing configuration, advisory group members ranked safety as the top priority, where non-advisory group members placed a higher priority on reduced travel time. And talking about travel time, I know, Michael, we haven't met you, so I apologize for using your first name. I don't really know you yet, but Michael, you had mentioned about travel time and safety, and that is the absolute theme that we see recurring throughout all of the survey results and through our open-ended results as well, and then also through our listening sessions. Nearly half of advisory group participants indicated that they did not have a preference at all regarding access to Hayden Island or Marine Drive. That was actually one of the answers, and over half of respondents said that they were not concerned about or did not have a preference about that interchange. As for transit design options, travel time again was the #1 priority across the board, but even more so among advisory group members. Not significantly, was about 71% of advisory group members marked travel time as the top priority, where it was about 63% overall, but still the top priority across the board. Next slide, please. So overall takeaways on design options. And first, I want to take a second to remind everyone that since the design options were and still are being refined and developed, and they certainly were at the time of this engagement period, that rather than focusing on specific design options, we focused on gathering input around values and priorities for the corridor, for the program, and for the communities. So we were focused on what people liked about the design options in general, rather than asking them for feedbacks on specifics about each design option. So that said, we can't report back on a consensus on any one design, but rather what this report and what all of this data is intended to show is the values and the priorities of the community, and then how those values and priorities can be applied to the various design options. So congestion, not surprisingly, people don't like congestion. I always feel like that's kind of the gimme answer with transportation feedback, is the #1 priority is reducing consumption or congestion. But it's important to note that folks' desire for reduced congestion is related to not only the easing of trips and reducing travel times, but also the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And that showed up high in both our survey results and also in all of the qualitative feedback that we received as well. That kind of rolls into our very mixed feedback, though, about the number of lanes. We had no consensus on number of lanes. We heard everything from put in as many lanes as possible to completely reduce congestion as much as possible, to reduce the bridge footprint as small as possible out of environmental concerns. So we really didn't come to a great consensus there. But again, reducing travel times was the top priority across the board. And that was consistent among travelers who use the bridge by a personal vehicle, as well as those who use the bridge through public transit. Next slide, please. So our equity priority community engagement, and again, this was such a high priority and it was really done very well. I believe you all had already a presentation on the mini grant program that we executed through our CBOs, through our community business community-based organizations. But just a quick reminder about those programs. The purpose of those sessions was to facilitate affinity learning spaces for specific equity-based communities. We wanted to not only give us as the program an opportunity to understand or to explain the program, but more importantly, we wanted to hear the opinions and the priorities for the program from those communities. So that's really what these listening sessions were about. And one of the big takeaways, and I won't go through all of this content, there is a lot on there. So you can certainly read through those. And again, we've provided the slides. But one big takeaway was how much the participants stated that they appreciated these listening sessions and these affinity spaces. Surveys provide great quantitative results. And those kind of hard numbers are really good for some analysis purposes. I'm personally a numbers girl, so I love diving into data. I love trying to extrapolate information and draw conclusions from that information. But we also know, and we really have to acknowledge, that surveys are not always the preferred method for participation among all of our interested and impacted participants. So it is absolutely essential that we provide these affinity spaces, that we work with people to find ways to meet folks in their communities so that everyone can provide feedback through their preferred methods. And the surveys are not always the best method for that. And they're certainly not the best for gathering qualitative data. So these listening sessions, they were a very effective tool. Again, the qualitative feedback is so important to be used in conjunction with the quantitative feedback that we received from the survey. So next slide. As long as we're all talking about high capacity transit, I'll just share some of those results here as well. Once again, travel time reigned supreme. It was the most important attribute across all of our demographic groups. We provided a list of priorities. I want to say there were 8 or 10 different priorities, and we asked participants to rank their top 4. And you can see over there on the right side of the slide how those ranked. 63% ranked travel time as the top priority. About 43% ranked level of service as the next priority. And then it was followed pretty equally among easiness of access points, safety, and of course, reliability as being the most important options to look at for transit. The majority of transit users said they would access the transit stations by car. And just kind of an aside here, we did a significant amount of cross tabulations of all of our data results. And one of the things we looked at, in addition to basic demographics, was the location of survey respondents. So so we were able to look at responses coming from Oregon survey participants as well as Washington participants. And in multiple questions, Oregonians stated they were more likely to walk, bike, or roll in general. And we found that in questions related to the mixed use path for Hayden Island in several different areas. In this question specifically, we found that Oregon residents were more likely than Washington residents to bike, walk, or roll to a transit station. Youth, so I showed that list over there on the side of the top priorities. Youth were the only group that did not fall into that same list of categories, and they marked cost of user as one of their top priorities after travel time. Jana?
Yeah, I'm curious on your last point where it says half of all respondents chose to skip the questions related to transit.
Yeah.
I apologize. There goes my.
No, it's okay. I thought it was mine.
No, it was mine. Does that indicate to you from a survey perspective that transit was unimportant or less important to those individuals that didn't respond to the transit questions? How do you evaluate that?
You know, it's an interesting question, and it is one of the first things that jumped out at me. And I actually have the follow-up. I was just about to mention that as you just said, half of the respondents skipped the question completely. I'll go ahead, if I can jump to the next slide, that'll help answer this question as well. One of the things I think it indicates is that if you look at this bottom point on this slide as well, so half of all participants did not answer the question. They just skipped the question entirely, the entire 3 or 4 questions that we had about transit. But we also had an opportunity for an open-ended survey comments at the end of the survey. And we received about 1,700 open-ended survey comments. Each one of those was coded, and over 750 of the comments, so just about half of those comments, mentioned public transit as in part of their comment. 67% of those expressing support for it, where 30% expressing opposition. So specifically what it says, again, quantitative data only tells us so much, but what I can extrapolate from that, and I think that we can make the jump to, is that while it's a smaller group of people who might be interested in transit, the folks who are interested in the transit options are very interested in it, and they have very definite opinions, and they need to, we need to my suggestion, at least in moving forward, is that we make sure that we do some transit specific engagement, because the folks who it is important to, it's very important to them. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Nicole,
yes,
we've got about 3 more minutes.
Okay, I'm going quick.
Just going to give you a heads up.
Okay, you can read it right there. Non-white and youth participants, just in terms of location, wanted a location close to Clark College, and the Vancouver waterfront was also very important. Next slide. And then lastly, our community working groups. We held 4 different community working groups with a total of about 81 participants. Overall, their support for high capacity transit and multimodal transportation options, but also for increased parking options to support that increased transit use. So that was something that we heard consistently among those working groups. They also had a desire for greater connectivity from Clark County into Portland and the regional transit system in general, and then also for increased access to downtown Vancouver and the waterfront. So that's it. Next slide, next steps. I'm going to come in there right under my little 2-minute mark. And so we will be using this feedback for others, along with other screening criteria to help identify that modified LPA. We will be looking at our next phase of engagement, both leading up to what that LPA is going to look like, and then also, of course, into the NEPA process as well. That was quick. I'm out of breath. I need a sip of water.
Thank you very much. Thank you for kind of getting us through that data. And we all received the very extensive detailed report. If you want to dig in, it's a long read, but if you want to dig in on any of the individual components, it's really helpful. And I also just want to call out, if you remember when we saw the previous presentation and we added 2 options with different stops in Clark County, it was reflecting this data. It was looking at Clark College, it was looking at the waterfront. So I just want to kind of reiterate that the input that the program is getting, we're seeing it, you know, be reflected in activities later on. So with that, we do have time for questions. So it's fine to ask questions. We have a few minutes, so a lot of information there.
I answered them all in advance. I am here though, if anybody does come up with any questions, or if anybody wants to shoot me an email or just go through data with me, like I said, I'm happy to go through data at any time.
Well, if there aren't questions now, we can save the time, and then at the end, if things do pop up, we can add it there. But I don't. Oh, please, Michael.
Very, very quick. Nicole, how would we get a hold of you? Is that in the slide deck?
I don't know. I will, Jason can send out my email.
Absolutely. And as Lynn did mention, the full community engagement report has been sent to you all with the links to the website, but I'll follow up and send that again. And I will include Nicole's contact information, so you guys could, if you have some direct questions, you can email her and bypass me. But if you have any more general questions, you can always get a hold of me. But certainly we'll make Nicole available.
Yeah, and I didn't take I'll take that last 30 seconds just to introduce myself. I just realized I haven't been introduced to this group, so I apologize. I have taken over as the community engagement lead. I've been with the program since about December. So my first task was going through this survey and really getting up to speed with everything. So I'm excited to have been a part of that report and looking forward to really advancing the community engagement moving forward and to working with this group.
Yeah, I should have acknowledged this was your first time presenting. So thank you for that. And again, thank you for kind of moving us through lots of data. Any other questions? Otherwise, I will move us to Jake, who has presented to us multiple times, but has more great data. So Jake, can you start us off with transit equity and related?
Sure thing, Lynn. Thank you. And good to be here again in front of you all. Hope you are having a wonderful week, staying warm. So what I'm going to share with you today is it's basically a part 1 of some equity analysis that we're doing and have done on the different transit investment scenarios. So I have a bunch of caveats on this, a bunch of information, but we'll welcome your questions at the end. So if we can go to the next slide. If you'll recall our equity framework, we have 6 specific objectives that we are trying to stay true to honor the program's commitment to centering equity. This analysis I'm going to share is really focused on the mobility and accessibility objective, in particular, as it's titled, looking specifically at the benefits, potential benefits, and how those compare between options. Next slide. So there are 2 things, 2 components of this analysis I'm going to share. And while they are certainly both 2 inputs into the whole equity consideration, they are kind of separate. And I'll explain that a little further. The first element of this is looking at the population and demographics around station areas, the potential different station areas, to say, who is served by these, who lives within walking distance? Do some investments serve specifically BIPOC and low-income populations better than others? The other piece of this analysis is looking at access to jobs, saying how much do different investment options increase access to jobs via transit within certain timeframes. And yes, this is about job access, but jobs also serve as a good proxy for access to other services, shopping, education, healthcare, because people need to work in those places. So it's found to be a good thing to analyze, not just employment. And then again, to what degree between these different investments, to what degree would they improve job access for BIPOC and low-income populations? And then how does that compare to white and higher income populations? So we'll go through those. Next slide, please. Here's the caveats, all kinds of caveats. What this is, what this isn't. So what this is, it's the first type of analysis is an analysis of potential walking access. And then the jobs is looking at mobility benefits from these different high capacity transit investment scenarios. For now, these are geared towards Title VI guidelines, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. There are some certain regulations and requirements that when you're looking at transit and analyzing transit, that you specifically look at impacts and benefits to BIPOC and low-income populations. So this doesn't encompass all of the different demographics that are included in our equity definition for the program. For now, that is information that we are analyzing, just not presenting here. So that includes people with disabilities, that includes older adults, that includes youth, et cetera. And again, it's one component. This analysis is one component of the IBR equity commitment. Data is data, but it's not everything. People are not data, and data is imperfect. So keep that in mind. So what this is not, it's non-analysis of biking and park and ride access to the stations. The model that it's based on doesn't incorporate that, so that's forthcoming. It's not adequate to fully understand all benefits and burdens. This is just focusing on transit. There's a lot more to this program than transit, even though transit is obviously a crucial piece of the equity conversation. It doesn't look at property impacts. That's also one of those pieces that's not just about the benefits. It's about are there potential displacements of residences or businesses associated with the different transit investments. It's not a comprehensive review of all transit investments made and equity initiatives in the region. It's focused specifically on this program, IBR program. And it's not inclusive of all actions that need to be taken if communities are going to realize the access and mobility benefits. And by that, I mean, we know that folks have been experiencing displacement through gentrification. Folks are being pushed to further out areas of the region, including Clark County, when they do rely on jobs and services, say in Portland or more close in to the job centers. And so if folks are to be able to access these transit investments and access the places that these transit investments would improve service to, they need to live nearby there, and displacement impacts that and would not they would not realize those benefits. So all that in mind, I think we can move on to the actual analysis. So first part, Kelly talked about the different representative transit investments. So this is just kind of a review. She mentioned 11. In this list, I'm not including the bus on shoulder piece, since that's assumed to be a part of any investment. But here I'm showing a map that represents the various alignments and station locations, color coded along with this table, where it shows which ones are light rail, which ones are bus rapid transit, and the one that would be bus rapid transit for part and light rail for the other part. So just wanted to make sure we're using the same alignments that Kelly presented. Next slide. So in looking at who lives around stations, you could just draw a circle with a half-mile radius and say that's a half mile around a station, but that's not reality. People can't just walk in any direction for a half mile and access a transit station. So what we use to analyze this we call them walk sheds. It's essentially where a person can actually walk, do a half-mile walk from a station on the existing street and sidewalk network. So it's just a more precise way to try to get who actually has access to a station within a reasonable walk. Usually a half mile is used for high capacity transit. And so this map shows the various walk sheds around the different stations on the different transit investments. Next slide, please. All right, so there's a lot here, but again, color coded to the map on the left. We have the different investments and who lives near those stations within that half-mile walk, and specifically calling out BIPOC and low-income residents. So this is ordered from top to bottom in terms of the greatest number of residents. Also, this does align with just residents overall. So we have with these longer alignments that generally have more stations, they serve more people or have more people within walking distance of a station. Pretty common sense there. So that's a pretty strong correlation. If you have more transit, you're gonna serve more people. But then the other piece of that is in any sort of equity analysis, we want to look at the composition of neighborhoods and station areas in terms of the demographics and say, are we serving communities that are representative of the greater community or of the city that we're in, or are we missing them? So we looked at the percentage of residents who are BIPOC and residents who are low income within these station areas. The results are it's pretty consistent across the board. So for example, on the BIPOC residents, if you look at the percentages, it's about a quarter, 23 or 26% of residents around those full alignments, around all the stations with those alignments, are BIPOC, meaning any race besides white, non-Hispanic. Low income, it's pretty consistent across all of the different investments, around 34, 40% or so. It's a little lower if you look down in the purple at option I, LRT Expo to I-5 McLaughlin. A little bit lower percentage of those residents are lower income, about 31%. But that is on par for the program area as a whole. It's about 32, 33% of residents that are low income. And the low income definition we use, by the way, for those who are keeping track, is at or below twice the federal poverty level, just so you know. All right, let's go to the next slide. So here's some general takeaways. I mentioned, more longer alignments, more stations, more residents within a half-mile walk. That's true. And it is true for BIPOC and low-income residents. The investments seem to be similar in terms of percentage of the populations within a half mile that are BIPOC and low income. The one exception I pointed out, the low-income population around investment I, that expo to I-5 in McLaughlin, that doesn't include a waterfront station, is somewhat lower than the others. So that's the walking distance station area demographic analysis. The next one is the jobs and as a proxy for services access. This one's a little more complicated. Anyone who wants to dig into the dirty details of all that went into this analysis, happy to do that over a beer anytime, but probably don't have the time to go into that here. But at a high level, so what this analysis does is it looks at projected jobs in a model for 2045. Unfortunately, we don't have demographic projections at the level we need to be able to do it with 2045 projected demographics. So we have to use current demographic data. It's kind of one limitation. The baseline we're using to compare these different investments is the projected 2045 transit network. And so that includes all 3 CTRAN Vine lines that will be in operation. It includes all other planned service investments from TriMet and CTRAN. So it's looking at what we know or what we anticipate, given the information we have now, of what will be on the ground in 2045, regardless of IBR. Travel time includes walking and riding transit, as well as transfers to the network. So it's going to be showing what the impact is for each investment option, but it also that incorporates people who are traveling on other parts of the network, transferring to the investment option, transferring from. So it's comprehensive and incorporated in that way. And then finally, it analyzes access to jobs for residents of the program area, specifically both sides of the river, Washington and Oregon. We also have other analysis that looks at it for residents of different neighborhoods of the region as a whole, but we're just presenting here the program area residents, as those are the folks most impacted by this project. Next slide. So this map here I'm showing is that no build that I mentioned, where it's the projected network in 2045. And it's showing that network, those green lines, the thicker ones are high capacity transit. I'll note that the yellow line, for some reason, didn't show up as a thick line, so that should be, but anyway, ignore that. So the darker the color here, what this is showing is if you were to leave on transit from that point, the darker the color, the more jobs you'd be able to reach. So the example I'm showing is if I take transit from downtown Vancouver, you can see it's a little darker. It's kind of covered up by those green lines. In 2045 again, even if we didn't have IBR, I could reach between 50 and 100,000 jobs within 45 minutes during the midday. So this is the baseline of where we're starting. We want to know what these different investment options, what they would do to improve access to jobs within certain timeframes. Next slide, please. And like I said, the program area residents is who we looked at this for, or who we're showing this for here. This map, I've shown this equity index map before to this group, but just as a refresher, this is overlaying all of our equity definition demographic groups that we are calling equity priority communities. The darker areas are where there are greater concentrations of those groups. So if you see downtown Vancouver is a little darker. Also the area around sort of Rose Village, Fourth Plain Village, along Fourth Plain Boulevard there, where the Vine runs. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the area. Not surprised, it's a high concentration of communities of color. It's where the International District is. There's a lot of multifamily housing. So those help us kind of inform, even if that area is not in the immediate program area, it can help inform what the impact of the different investments is for specific communities that we are prioritizing in terms of looking at impacts based on equity. So if we go to the next slide, wanted to share also that there are, I mentioned this isn't a complete analysis of all equity initiatives and investments in the region, but we should note that there's been a lot. So on the Washington side of the river, for example, City of Vancouver has done a similar kind of equity index map to what I just showed, a little different methodology, but then here showing, essential places that folks access and where the vine lines are to show that this is all part of an overall strategy. This plays into this, whatever investment comes out of this project, high capacity transit wise, it feeds into these other systems to improve equitable outcomes and access. Next slide, please. Here are some results. So I'll walk through this. If we compare what the different investments, how they improve job access, we can look at by a certain time frame. So here, what I'm showing is within 45 minutes during the midday from the IBR program area, we can see who and how different populations are impacted. And the way this is done is sort of looking at the average person from this group. So it's the way to read this is the average BIPOC person under a no build scenario would have access to about 26,000 jobs within 45 minutes during the midday, compared to white population or the average white person would have closer to 24,400 jobs. I see there's a hand up.
I'm curious as to what hours you're looking at midday and why midday is the time frame for this.
Yeah, so midday, I believe it is 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And I'll have to check with the person who ran the model to get that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. The reason I'm showing midday, and we also have looked at morning as well, morning peak. Midday tends to be the time when the ridership on transit is disproportionately lower income, transit dependent, as opposed to peak riders, peak period riders. Certainly these populations ride at all times, but midday is particularly important for a lot of populations who might have jobs that are outside of the typical 9 to 5. And so that's why we focused on that and showed that here. So when we're comparing across, we can kind of compare this in two different ways. We can compare across these different investments and say, to what degree, again, do the different investments improve access to jobs? And so if you kind of go from top to bottom, just pick a column and go from top to bottom. And let's say in that second column over under if we go under the BIPOC population, so on investment B, which was the 2013 LPA, locally preferred alternative, that appeared to increase job access compared to the no build by about 28,000 jobs within 45 minutes. If you go down from there, F, not quite as impactful. The other BRT options, not quite as impactful until you get down to option J, LRT Expo to Kiggins Bowl, also about 28,000 more jobs reachable within 45 minutes. And so on. And then the percentage increase is just right next to that. So those 110%, 96%, those are about doubling of the number of jobs due to these investments that would be reachable in 45 minutes. So that's one comparison across the different investments, but then we can also compare across populations to see, does a certain investment benefit one group more than another? And what you'll see across these, there are a lot of similarities, a lot of similar numbers here, and but there are some differences. You can see on, let's say, take option H in yellow there, the LRT Expo to Turtle Place, seems to benefit the average white program area resident, and by average I mean based on where they live, seems to benefit a little more in terms of jobs access compared to the average BIPOC program area resident, about a 39% increase compared to 31%. A couple others where that disparity exists. Look at J, LRT Expo to Kiggins Bowl, 118% versus 110% increase. Both obviously huge increases in terms of accessibility, but a little better for if you look at the average white person. Then you see the opposite trend on, say, see the opposite trend on, sorry, I lost it. Jason, you want to full screen that again? Yeah. Pulled up another email. Are you multitasking? Who would
Sorry
ever do
about that, folks.
I'm just kidding. So if you look at like option I, LRT Expo to I-5 and McLaughlin, it's actually a little more beneficial for BIPOC as compared to white. And so that's sort of the comparison we do here to draw the conclusions that I'll get to in a sec. Next slide. I'm not going to go over this one. If you go back one, I'm not going to go over the 60-minute one in as much detail since I walked through that, and findings are fairly similar, but just different degrees of increase. Obviously, you can reach a lot more jobs in 60 minutes than 45. But in terms of different kind of differences between white and BIPOC populations, very similar trends there compared to 45 minutes. Then the next slide shows 45-minute access for low income versus higher income. And that's, again, the average program area resident who is low income versus higher income. Here is where there are a greater degree of difference between low income and higher income than we saw by race. But it's similar based on the investment option. So on option J, for example, you have 120% increase in job access compared for the higher income population versus 98% for low income population. Again, both very high, but a bit better for higher income. But then the reverse trend for, say, options I and L. Martha, got a question?
Yeah, I see that on both this page and the last one, and I don't understand why this is. So there's a really big difference between option D and H in terms of access, but they're both going from the same place to the other place, right? So yeah, why is BRT so much less than LRT?
Yeah, and it has to do with transfers. I know that much in the model and how that operates, essentially where transfers happen and how they happen, whether it's transferring from BRT to LRT or BRT to BRT. In terms of the time frame, there's a time penalty there for BRT. It takes longer. And I think that has to do with the assumptions about how frequently they run. It's baked into the model to a greater degree than I can probably explain, not being a modeler. But there's something along those lines. Okay, so then the next slide, which you have at your disposal is the same thing for looking at increases for 60-minute transit trips. You can review that. It's fairly similar in terms of the comparisons. There are a couple differences, but like, for example, the difference on option J in the blue there, kind of similar. But then even across the vast majority of them, but it's just a matter of how those cutoffs are between how long it takes to get somewhere on the different options between 45 and 60 minutes. Because there can be certain job centers where there's a lot of jobs that you can't quite reach in 45, you can in 60, and that can even things out a little bit. Tom?
since these are increases, I understand you're trying to show by economic and BIPOC and all, but since we're talking increases, it looks like to me that J in this situation gives you 150,000 more jobs. Why wouldn't that just beat the heck out of H, who only gives you 60,000?
So, yeah, I wouldn't say just minor detail. It's the numbers are the additional jobs that are shown in the colored boxes. So like 68,482. That's the additional jobs that
Right.
that investment would do. But yeah, I mean that's what the model is showing, and that is certainly
I mean,
what
if we
this
looked at
analysis
that,
was.
we'd say, well, 88% versus 116 is not as beneficial as some of the others. But if we look at it and say 150,000 versus the 27,000 in G, seems like to me that that's a no-brainer.
I mean, the analysis is definitely trying to get to the degree of impact, the degree of benefit. Yeah, I mean, those numbers are a pretty stark difference. I think that's part of why there are certainly a lot of other considerations, of course, and I don't want to necessarily bias what I'm seeing, bias you by what I'm seeing specifically, except I'll share some general takeaways. But yeah, that's there are some pretty huge differences in how they perform.
And if I can jump in real quick, there are a lot of other factors that go in, such as cost, such as other impacts of different alternatives. There are trade-offs involved with each of these decisions. This is just one of the lenses of which we're looking at this through.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, that played back to the kind of caveats. This is part of the analysis. It's sort of it's not the end all be all, but certainly important information.
And Jake, I apologize, but I just want to do a time check so we get through your whole presentation.
Sure. Yeah, I think the next slide's my last one. So just some takeaways that we talked about. Light rail investments appear to have a greater benefit in terms of jobs access than the BRT options. But all investments would increase job access for these communities on average, as much as 2 times for several of them. Most of them would increase job access for the BIPOC program area residents as much or more than white residents. There are a few exceptions to that. And then investments are kind of mixed in terms of comparison of increased job access for low income versus higher income residents of the program area. I've explained that a little bit in more detail on that sub bullet. So, and also noted that I mentioned we've looked at other geographies. And so looking at like that equity priority area of the Rose Village, Fourth Plain Village area, as well as residents of the greater region, across the board on those, low income residents on average would see greater or as much increase in job access compared to their counterparts. And I believe that is it for me.
I want to invite questions, but I do want to stress the 45-minute travel time is from like the time you get on the bus or LRT till you get to your destination or till you get off the transit.
Includes walk time to access and from when you get off the bus as well as any transit. Yep.
Okay, great.
Could we check in just to see how many we might have signed up for public comment, so that may affect our ability to do too many questions and answers, or how we stage that? Jason and Brent?
Yeah, currently no one has signed up for public comment.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Back to you, Lynn.
Just, are there other questions or clarifications? I think we all know there's a lot of information, but I really want to stress if there's something that you're not quite understanding, like Tom, I appreciated your clarifying question about we add up the 2 columns, right? And that's the net. And so I think any other questions that'll help any of us understand the data better are particularly welcome, but anything else you'd like to ask? I will also point out that we do have representatives here with us. Thank you, from CTRAN and the City of Vancouver. So if there's anything more specific that you want to dig into, we have Lifeline experts who haven't promised to answer all questions, but they're going to do their best. Whitney?
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify, I was looking at the map that was shown, and to clarify, the on the Washington side, one of the largest job creators is A1A, and so I'm wondering if that was part of, if that's part of the area that was evaluated.
It is, because it as long as it's within what was modeled, well, if there was transit access modeled to A1A, which I'm actually not sure, now that I say that, if there's a planned route to there that was included in the model, then it would include those jobs that would be accessible in 2045.
I don't know the stop that would be closest to A1A. It's on page slide 50. If someone who's maybe a little more familiar, we could see if it's included there or not. Or Whitney, you could check it and come back.
Yeah, it's definitely quite a bit farther north than any of these investments
Sorry,
would
52.
reach, but
yeah, 52. I did the same thing for WSU Vancouver, right? Because it's up that way. Other questions? If not, Lisa can start to walk us through what's up next. I do want to thank everyone for kind of holding tight and hanging on. That was an awful lot of information for us to absorb in a short period of time. Any other questions before Lisa starts with moving forward? I don't see any hand raised, so Lisa Schauer, take it away.
All righty. Thanks, Lynn. So we spent time really presenting to you, and we've heard a lot of interest in making sure that we're creating a two-way dialogue, and there wasn't a lot of space for that. So we want to follow up in our next meeting with some space around discussions, questions relative to transit mode. Any questions that you showed up with today that you feel like maybe weren't quite answered or you want more information on, will you please send an email to Jason? We want to make sure that we're prepared for that conversation. We also are completely open to having a dialogue with you directly, and we're connecting you with some of our engineers that might be able to help answer some of those questions. As was discussed earlier, we discussed the Hayden Island Marine Drive. What you saw from Nicole was the ability to not only share with you kind of our overall strategy and the results of the intense engagement that was done during the fall time period. She also focused on specifically the transit results. So you'll see Nicole come back again to our next meeting, and she will focus more on the Hayden Island Marine Drive. Again, you all have access to that report, but as Lynn mentioned, it's a significant report. And so we want to just pull the key items that help us frame where the community input was during this time period around the topic that we are going to spend more time really getting into. So next time, transit, you've already heard the community engagement results. We'll share the community engagement results specific to Hayden Island Marine Drive. We are also hoping that our engineering team that have visited here before will be able to review with you the Hayden Island Marine Drive design options. And then several of you have already shared with us where you have had the opportunity to participate in the community working group. And so we're interested in your feedback in terms of what was shared at that community working group and how we move towards creating some synergy around a recommendation that we anticipate coming from the program relative to Hayden Island Marine Drive. Next slide. So we have our community advisory group now on a pace of every couple weeks, which means that when we finish a meeting, we're working on the next set of information so that we can send that out to you so that you have the opportunity to be able to review it and be ready to have a conversation. We really do want to transition these meetings so that they become more of a dialogue and an opportunity for you to engage in questions as opposed to just presentations. We also have the executive steering group on March 17th. The equity advisory group met earlier this week. They meet again March 21st. And then we're back again with the community advisory group on March 24th. Jason's going to make sure that everyone has updated meeting notices. I think those have all gone out. I know our website was updated with our revised timing.
And I will just jump in maybe in front of Jake. The Equity Advisory Group did meet on Monday, and due to some timing issues and the 21st being, I think, start of spring break and a couple other issues, that has actually been moved up to March 14th is the Equity Advisory Group. So if you are interested in watching or following along that public meeting, that'll be on the website, but it is Monday the 14th.
Late breaking news. Let's see, future CAG topics. I think we covered most of this just in terms of engagement, community working groups, and then the key components of the modified LPA design that each of those topics were not only recognized as areas that you want to spend time talking about, but that are those components that we do want to make sure that there's enough time for a dialogue and some information sharing. And we've taken time to listen to where you're at on each of those components. So this is the time where we typically have public comments. Brent, do we have anyone that signed up?
No one has signed up yet.
Okay, I will just review again that in order to make a public comment, that we ask that you dial in at 1-669-900-6833. The meeting ID is 993-5459-6043. And the passcode is 674942. Dial *9 to raise your hand, and I will call on you to provide public comment. Dial *6 to unmute yourself. Lynn, did you want to? I know Martha has her hand up, but I'm curious if you have something that you want to.
Martha can go first. I'll
okay.
clean up.
Okay, Martha.
As both states are reducing or eliminating their masking requirements, do you anticipate us meeting in person anytime soon?
I would love to meet with you in person, but right now we really have to respect and honor where both of our DOTs are in terms of their guidance. And to the best of my knowledge, that guidance has not changed, that we'll continue to do virtual meetings. Our virtual meeting space also allows for a lot of access for other community members to be able to participate and be a part of this conversation. So I will just say that I don't believe that there's a plan for us to meet in person in the near term, but we're watching as the guidance changes how we might be able to meet this group's needs in terms of in-person, virtual, or hybrid. I see both Sam and Lynn. Lynn, do you?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this last 6 weeks or so, I just want to give a huge shout out both to all of the community advisory group members for each of you being willing to kind of double up on meetings. It's critical for us to be able to execute the responsibilities and the purpose that each of us joined the CAG, but it's also a huge ask. So I just want to say each of you have been very generous in agreeing to the additional meetings. Thank you for that. And I also want to acknowledge the work of the staff. I've seen just incredible not quite 24/7, but almost, in terms of trying to develop materials and thoughtfully curate them for presentation. So I just wanted to really thank everyone, because we're getting to crunch time. We've been committed all along, but it's accelerating, and the work of everybody on this call has really made a difference. So thank you. And with that, I think, Sam, you're up.
Well, I just want to echo what Martha and Lynn has been talking about here. First of all, as we go into twice a month meeting cadence, I think there'll be greater chance, at least for me anyway, of 100% participation if we have some sort of a hybrid, even after this pandemic becomes an endemic, and it's, we don't have to social distance or wear a mask or get vaccinated anymore. I'll continue to be cautious, but also, so I would vote for a hybrid approach, if at all possible, going into rest all of our meetings. I want to echo what Lynn said about the staff. I thought this was just tremendous work. And I don't think because, we're asking questions about the data and so forth, it's not any kind of a reflection on the staff. It is more of us wanting to understand, and because there's so much information that we really need to absorb. When I got how many slides are there? 73 slide deck, trying to absorb all that and going, wow, I can only skim through this. And I really appreciate going through this in detail. So, I think we do ask really good questions. It's not to challenge, but rather to understand. At least that's from my perspective. So thank you.
Thank you, Sam. I want to pass it over. Oh, Greg, yes.
A couple of things I wanted to address. And so I've been working projects, large complex projects with a lot of public input. But this is a tremendous treat for me to see how engaged the community advisory group is, the great questions that are asked. So I just want to let you know how much you are appreciated in this process. And as Lisa said, I would love when we can sit down in the same room. Some of you may know that we are building out our office in downtown Vancouver, which will have meeting space where eventually we will have hybrid. I don't think we'll ever go fully back to all in person. I think we will have hybrid type opportunities. But I look forward to the day where we can sit in the same room safely and have these type of intimate conversations and read each other's body language. But I do want to thank everybody. This is tough work, and you guys have, it's been over a year since you've been meeting with us, and it's not easy. We appreciate your time tremendously. So thank you.
I was going to pass it to you. So I'm glad that you stepped in, Greg. That was great. Ed, do you want to wrap us up? It sounds like we don't have any public comment tonight. We're right at 5:59. So why don't you go ahead and close this out tonight? I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. Just want to say that this has really been a great meeting, and I would like to, on behalf of the entire group, thank the presenters tonight, and Lynn, thanks for the excellent job that you did tonight. And thanks to all of you for your attention and your great questions. Let's keep it up. We're probably just getting ready to hit our speed now. If you're driving, or unless you're home, be careful out there. Stay warm. We'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.